This is the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. Here's Robert Kiyosaki.
Hello. It's Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. And as you probably know, we broadcast from Old Town Scottsdale, Arizona, where it's either heaven or hell. And right now it's a little chilly, but it's better than being too hot. And joining us today is Kim. She's back in town, back in the room here with us.
Yes, I am. Happy to be here.
And we have a great friend of hers on our guest as our
friend of
guest
ours
today. Her name is Nomi Prins. She wrote the book Collusion. If you guys want to find out what's really going on, it's her book Collusion. I read the book. I was sitting in Alaska for 10 days. I couldn't put your book down, Nomi. It was a fascinating book, but it's how the central bank system, which is the Fed, the EC, European Central Bank, the BOJ, is the Bank of Japan, and the PB, the People's Bank of China, how they operate. So it's a very well-written, well-documented book. The great thing about it, Nomi, it's easy to read and understand, but it's so big picture, it's kind of hard to imagine that a bunch of criminals like the Fed can be allowed to operate and destroy our economic system. And I do call the Fed a criminal organization because if you look at what they've done, they've basically backed the investment banks of the world. And now America's about to go broke. The world's going broke because of this collusion. But I think what you were writing about just fascinated me is how after the Fed started QEing, which is quantitative easing, another word for it is counterfeiting money out of thin air, and then the other central bank says, hey, United States is screwing us too because we have creditor nations, which are Japan, China, and Singapore. They lend us money, and we're a debtor nation. America's now the biggest debtor nation in the world. So the debtor nation, the U.S., is screwing the creditor nation, which is Asia. And that's really what's going on. So your book, Collusion, is a must-read for anybody who really wants to know what's going on. Any comments on that, Nomi?
And Nomi, just a little bit of your background, because you know Wall Street because you worked in Wall Street and you were in the midst of all of it. So can you give us just a little bit of your background on how you became such the expert?
Yeah, sure. So actually, some of the first, let's just talk about what a central bank is, because that was kind of key to my background on Wall Street. And when I worked throughout the city of London and traveled to these central banks around the world, including China and the Philippines and Thailand and Malaysia. I mean, literally almost all of them from the early 90s through today. So from the standpoint of banking and who supplies the banks with their money. I mean, Robert, you mentioned that, the Fed's kind of a criminal organization. It's like they are producing money as a central bank. It's sort of like the mother bank where like all the other sort of children banks can go to when they run out of money because of various risky activities they do. So like in terms, and this does relate to my experience as a young banker, in terms like if you think of it like a car, where like a teenager goes out, mom, dad, I want the car, goes out, like runs the car into something on like a binge drinking night, but the teenager's fine, the car's not, and then comes back to the parents and is like, hey, I kind of crashed the car, but I really want another car, okay? And the parents, which would never happen in real life, are like, yeah, sure, let's just get you another car. As opposed to, no, you cannot have another car. You are grounded. You're not leaving your room for like another year, right? But in banking, and I say this because it relates to my history as well. One of the first things I did with my first bonus check as a banker, I was living in London. It was the first time I got any pile of money that was, useful to spend on something I needed. I went out and bought a car. And I went to the dealership, and I was this like young girl from like America. I was in England. I wanted to buy a car, and they looked at me and they're like, "So your parents gonna sign for this?" And I was like, "No." They're like, "Is your boyfriend, your husband?" Like, no, it's gonna be me. And I bought this car, and it's sort of.
No wonder you love Kim so much because you have the same attitude.
But really, so I had a 15-year career on Wall Street. That was sort of in the beginning to middle of it when I was in London, and I ran a group of sort of quants, or basically, PhDs and analytical people, et cetera, to go around the world and sort of analyze a couple different things. What was happening in the world with respect to within countries, between countries, what was happening to their debt, what was happening to their stock markets, what was happening to their people. Although the people part, when I was on Wall Street, was less of a concern to Wall Street traders, our senior executives who made great bonuses and sort of decided what bonuses went to other people throughout the years than it should have been. And one of the reasons that I left Wall Street after 15 years, I had reached the position of a managing director at Goldman Sachs, which is pretty coveted. I was not only one of the few managing directors, I was one of the very few female managing directors in that position. But I sensed that at that time, which was early 2000s, the chasm, the sort of gap between what Wall Street was doing for itself and to the world, and how it benefited ordinary people or ordinary smaller and medium-sized businesses was just too wide. And the way in which they were sort of extracting money and security from individual citizens and small and medium businesses was just too much. And that was one of the reasons that ultimately I wound up quitting to become a journalist, to try to explain how this process all worked, and ultimately to predict what our financial crisis in 2008 was all about. And since then, to go around the world to explain and dig into and get information about what's happening today that could cause another crisis, and how people can be affected and how they can protect themselves.
So which countries did you specifically go to? Because like I said, I was sitting in Alaska for 10 days, freezing my butt off, reading your book. I just couldn't put it down because you go so in depth on so many vital countries outside the U.S.
Yeah, so I did a bit of a world tour, and I started in Mexico. The reason for that was, and still is, that Mexico is a huge trading partner of the U.S. And its central bank, the Fed of Mexico, which can create some money for Mexico, doesn't at all have the kind of power that the U.S. Fed has to create money for the U.S. and U.S. banks, big banks, and their partners throughout the world. And then I went to Brazil, and then as sort of a major trading partner of the U.S. in Central and South America, a large economy, but an emerging economy, still a developing economy, and a great partner of China. And then I went to China to talk to the People's Bank of China there, and a lot of people internally in different organizations to see how money was working there. And then I went to Japan, and then I went throughout Europe and the UK. So I did a kind of world tour where I picked the regions, the countries that both were most prominent in different parts of their development and stages in the world, and the ones that also were most what I call pivotal, the ones that had to change the most in the sort of new reality of the Fed producing money and producing it at very low cost, and how that affected other countries who didn't have the same abilities that the Fed had to just coin money out of nowhere.
That's what collusion is about, is, from what I understand from reading your book, is that different central banks then got together and said, we got to almost protect ourselves from against the U.S.
What happened was, yes.
Didn't Japan join forces with China or something like that?
Yeah, so one of the things, so interesting partnerships developed in the wake of the financial crisis, and that's why the order of what I analyzed was important, because the Fed was faced in the crisis of 2008 with trying to figure out how to create out of nowhere, how to fabricate enough money to keep the whole entire international banking system afloat. Now, the international banking system and economy was really hurt by all of the nefarious things that the major Wall Street banks were doing. But the Fed had to step in, because the Wall Street banks didn't just operate in the U.S. They operated with Germany, with Deutsche Bank. They operated with UBS, with the Swiss bank. They operated throughout the world, and they were hurting. And the Fed had to come in and be like the parents to the kids who crashed the car and be like, here, have a car, have a car, have a car, have a car, creating them out of nowhere. But it wasn't enough. And so what the Fed had to do was collude with the major central banks around the world. And that was in the G7. So that was the banks that represented Japan, the Bank of Japan, the banks that represented Europe, the European Central Bank, England, the Bank of England, and say, look, we can't even though we can create money out of nowhere to help these banks who screw themselves and our entire economy and the markets, we still feel like we can't do it alone. We need your help. And that's where this collusion amongst the largest central banks in the world came in. The Fed said, look, you guys got to do what we're doing. You guys got to print money. You got to electronically fabricate money. You got to buy debt in your own country so we can produce more of it, so we can keep the economies going and pretend it's all okay. And that collusion happened. Now, in the meantime, which was really interesting, the world shifted. So China and the People's Bank of China called the Fed out on this. They called the guy who was running the Fed at the time, Ben Bernanke, out, and they said, look, you can't just produce money out of nowhere because at some point someone's got to pay it back, right? You can't just continue to float countries and just give them money just because their banking systems aren't that good, aren't that regulated, aren't doing what they should be doing for their country, for their citizens. And the People's Bank of China started developing these relationships with Japan, interestingly enough, because Japan was caught in the middle of being a G7 friend of the U.S. From a central banking standpoint as well, and trading with China. And China is saying, look, you can't just create money out of nowhere. And Japan saying, well, but we have been, even before the Fed started doing it. We just didn't know it could be done to such a large amount of money. We're talking trillions and trillions of dollars. And so China said, all right, you do what you need to do. And it was interesting. I talked to a lot of people inside of Japan and China who are working together sort of underneath the public position that their governments had, just to make sure things could run properly. And as ultimately it turned out, all of this money production, all of this collusion, all of this sort of back channeling amongst all of these banks ultimately created a world which we are dealing with now, where the money is too cheap, where there's too much debt, there's not enough investment because that debt's an overhang, and it affects real people. Because real people ultimately get no interest for their money because money's so cheap. They can't put money in a savings bank or a pension fund or in a good insurance policy because it doesn't pay enough. It doesn't pay enough to them to afford the lives they've built or they are building because it's all gone to the banking system. And it continues to do that.
So that's why, ladies and gentlemen, you've got to read her book, Collusion. I mean, what I love about it, Nomi, you kept it simple enough for me to understand. And the more I understood it, the more it gave me the courage to say in my book, which I just launched, called Who Stole My Pension, I call the Fed and the Treasury and Wall Street criminal operations because they claim to be for the people, but they're really ripping off the people. Think about this. Our school system is still teaching people to save money. Meanwhile, the Fed is printing trillions and the rest of the world is dropping interest rates to sub-zero. This has never happened in the history of the world. And our school system is still saying to kids, save money, work hard. I mean, you got to be kidding me. So that's why if you guys really want to know what's going on in the bigger picture, it's Nomi's book, Collusion. Nomi, congratulations on writing a very, very tough book, simple enough for a guy like me to understand.
Well, and I like this interview a lot because what you're talking about, Robert, is most people have no idea, absolutely no idea what's going on. And this is keeping it very simple and explaining what's happening. And when we come back, I want to find out Nomi's crystal ball, what's happening, what's going to happen, where we are, and yes, what you can do, because it doesn't sound like anything's going to change anytime too soon.
Or it's going to change dramatically quickly.
In a very explosive way.
So once again, it's Robert Kiyosaki, Kim Kiyosaki, and our guest today is Nomi Prins. Her book is Collusion. She's a former managing director of Goldman Sachs, who also run the central banks. But anyway, who's counting who's running the central banks here? But anyway, we'll come back. We're going more into what you can do. Most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, the question is, what are you going to do about it? Because the house of cards, in my opinion, is about to come down. We'll be right back. Welcome back, Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. You can listen to the Rich Dad Radio program anytime, anywhere on iTunes, Android, and YouTube. And then you can please leave us a review from wherever you listen. We archive every one of our programs at richdadradio.com. We archive them because we're an education company. We make no recommendations of what you should buy or sell. And we archive that stuff because if you listen to this program again, you'll pick up twice as much as you're listening to it right now. Also, another reason we archive it at richdadradio.com, you can share with friends, family, and business associates. And when you discuss it with friends, family, and business associates, your intelligence will quadruple. And our guest today is Nomi Prins, a friend of Kim, another rich woman. And they're talking about financial education for everybody. And Nomi's latest book is Collusion. Like I said, I was sitting in Alaska, freezing my butt off, reading Collusion, but I couldn't put it down because it's so in-depth, yet written simply enough for a person like me to understand.
And what I like, too, is, just by listening to this show, the one thing you can take away and guarantee is that the government and the Fed and the central banks are not looking out for your best interests. Matter of fact, they're doing everything against you. So if you think somebody else is going to come and save you and be the white knight or whatever, no, that's not possible. So it's all about what you can do, not what somebody else can do for you, what you can do.
Right. Nomi, does it make a difference if Elizabeth Warren or Sanders or Trump wins? Does it make any difference on the central banks at all?
No, because here's the thing. And as you guys were saying, why education and why people listening to, this show and other forms of individualized education is so important is because ultimately what's happening in the White House or in Congress or who's leaning where or who's saying what on the political trail doesn't at all impact how central banks, particularly the larger, most powerful ones like the Federal Reserve, which is the most powerful central bank producer of money in the world for its own banking system, behaves. When President Obama was in the White House, when President Trump's in the White House, on average, rates, the cost of money, has been about the same. Gone up a little, gone down a little, on average, about the same. When we look at the Fed basically dumping this money into the banking system. So what does that mean? How does that impact a real person? Let's think of it this way. Let's go back to what I was talking about before with the car example. Person crashes car, person goes to parents. Parents have two options. One is buy them a new car, or 10 new cars, or 20 new cars to keep it going. Don't teach them how to drive, or put them in their room and make them think about what they've done, or they don't. And in the situation with a central bank, which is a central place where other private banks can get money from cheaply, they don't have any requirement or any limitation put on them by any government, no matter who's running it. So the same exact stuff happens under a Republican government, a Democrat government. It doesn't matter. They're acting on behalf of their citizen, and their citizen is the private banking system, and that's what they do. So, when you're saying before about how Kim, these banks don't help the real person, you have to help yourself. That's really, really true. Because think about it, people don't have the ability to borrow money at 0%, right? They just don't. However, people are hurt by the fact that banks can borrow money at 0%. They can turn around and charge people a lot for loans, for credit cards, for student loans, for car loans, for whatever. So they get to make money in that process. And they also get to not pay people to save, which is why savings is not a way for people to grow their wealth. Saving money when you are not getting any percentage return on it, when banks are paying you close to zero for that savings for the use of your money, does not help you grow wealth. You don't have to be like a math person to get this. If you give somebody your money and you're like, hey, what are you going to give me back? And they say, well, basically less than you gave me, because not only am I not paying you interest on it, but I'm also going to charge you a fee for the luxury of me using it.
And
Like,
you're going
no one would do that.
And we're
But
going to
that's what we
print
do.
even more of it. We could just keep printing it and then charge you money to keep it in our banks. That's a criminal
That is right.
operation. You know,
Yes, that is absolutely right.
So that's why, you know, if guys read Rich Dad Poor Dad, you know, it's Rich Dad's lesson number one is rich don't work for money. Savers are losers. Your house is not an asset. I mean, it's because you're just giving money to the banks.
But even the save money, it just is like, it's this mantra that people just dish out, and they're not even paying attention to what's going on because they think that worked for mom and dad and that worked for grandma and grandpa, so it's going to work for me.
So let's go into the let's go into some solutions really quickly, and I'll just give you the one that I don't say do it, but right now I've been telling everybody to buy silver because silver is 72% off its all-time high. Mm-hmm. It's a bargain today. Yet mommy and daddy is still saying saving money, and this quantitative easing, they're printing, they're bailing out the biggest banks in the world through the repo market, and you're still saying to you, and they're still printing money, the zero interest rate policies. Everybody's, they're charging you money to keep money in the bank, and mommy and daddy still say save money. What's wrong with that picture, Nomi?
Well, that's the thing. When mom and dad or our grandparents talked about saving money, money was getting, 8, 9%.
14%, yeah.
15%,
yeah.
14, right?
Yeah.
So, depending on the year. So it kind of made sense. You could save money and you could get a decent return on it. But if you're getting zero and paying for the privilege,
and they're printing
you're just
it.
not.
Hey, Nomi,
that's not changing.
Let's go into this thing called MMT, Marxist money theory, which is being promoted in America today.
What does MMT stand for, Nomi? We got Robert's definition.
It does stand for modern monetary theory, but it's
Marxist.
not
Marxist.
So here's the thing about MMT. Marxist. Here's the thing about MMT. Actually, Marx wanted to be like Marx wanted people to actually make money off of their work, whereas actually MMT is not that. And what MMT is saying is it's really jumping on the bandwagon of what central banks have been doing these past 12 years, which is printing money, reducing its cost so that people, again, don't make money on savings, can't get their pensions paying for them that they've put in for all these years because their pensions aren't growing very fast because the interest on the pensions is down because money's too cheap because the Fed's fabricating all this money and the Treasury Department's creating all this debt because of it, and they're all fine, like just pushing this forward. MMT, modern monetary theory, is saying that thing the Fed's now been doing for the banks, printing money, fabricating electronic money, keeping rates low, buying debt so that the Treasury Department can create more of it, and central banks around the world are colluding and doing the same thing. Modern monetary theory says, all right, well, let's do that same exact thing, the same thing that's keeping rates so low. Let's do that more, okay? But let's do it for the people.
Correct.
And so it sounds
good.
On the surface, if you don't understand economics or math, it sounds good because it's like, okay, well, anyone can get behind the concept of, all right, well, if the Fed's going to be creating money anyway, how about it goes to us instead of the bank, so at least we can get a piece of it.
Everybody listen to Nomi because she's calling it exactly as it is. Everybody's saying, well, you give all the money to the bankers, just MMT is just give it to us. That's what they're saying, isn't it?
That's what it's saying.
And
isn't that what Ben Bernanke was calling helicopter money? They're just going to drop money on all of us?
Well, right. And Mario Draghi, who was the head of the European Central Bank, who's now gone off to do other, like, speaking gigs or whatever.
And he was...
that as well, when he was called Super Mario. Yeah, so here's the thing, though.
Wait, all those guys were Goldman guys, Nomi. They're all worked for Goldman. You notice that?
Well, they either do or they get paid to speak at Goldman, or they're Bill Buckley, who was the former New York Fed head. I worked with the guy. Anyway.
And Carney of
the
English, the Bank of England is a Goldman guy also,
So,
and so was Paulson, the head of our Treasury.
So it's Italy. Yeah, it goes on and on.
So what's wrong with what's wrong with printing more money and giving it all to the people? What's wrong with that theory?
So here's the exact problem. That theory forgets that, well, doing that creates zero interest rate money. It perpetuates zero interest rate money. It perpetuates the idea that we can kind of create money out of nowhere and somehow out of that produce returns for people, which doesn't actually make any sense. All it's doing is doubling down on the same strategy that has kept rates so low on savings for pension funds, on more secure securities for this whole time. And it's basically saying, all right, well, let's keep doing that. And it's like, well, but why would you get a different outcome? It does, like, let's put it this way. It doesn't matter if it's your son or your daughter who crashes the car. If the parents are going to keep on supplying cars without any sort of a step back to say, all right, well, maybe you should drive better. Maybe you shouldn't drive. Maybe you should,
Stop drinking.
take Uber, whatever. You can't just do the same strategy and expect a different result. Now, I am all for using debt to create good returns on investment, on business investment, on assets, on things that people can do if they want to have debt. And I know you guys talk about this, that it is good debt, that it's deployed in a way that allows people to grow financially. But if it's just done for the sake of creating it, then all that creation of debt does, without a plan, without any strategy, without any asset building exercises, is just basically decrease the value of interest rates and the value of money. And that does not help the average person. It does not help people grow the returns on their pension funds or their annuities or their life insurance annuities or whatever. It doesn't actually
Destroys the
help
system.
because it doesn't have a purpose.
So let me ask you this, Nomi, given your background and all this, is that how much time have we got left? I mean, how long can we keep QEing, which is basically counterfeiting money, and how long can we keep interest rates below zero? It's like taking a basketball and pushing it underwater and hoping volatility doesn't come back.
See, the question is this. What can people do while it's happening, and how long will it go? I think it can go on a very long time. It already has going on into its 12th year. And the reason for that is because there is no outside power that's higher than that of the major central banks that's going to come in and say, you know what, maybe you should just stop electronically fabricating money so that money can have some value. Because ultimately, there are too many players, hedge funds, banks, money managers and stuff who are working in the markets who are quite fine getting cheap money, investing it in the stock market, and I sometimes do that as well. But people who are more tactical about it and creating great returns of it, so they're not going to want that to stop. And the Fed's not going to want it to stop because it doesn't want to upset them, i.e. the big banks and their hedge fund clients and all of that. So what can a regular person do? What they can do is the exact same thing that these institutions are doing, which is with their money, find appropriate ways to invest it outside of that system, i.e. outside of a savings account or, a government bond account because they're not returning anything, and use it in a way in their lives where they can actually see that asset grow. So whether that is, so a real estate producing asset, whether that is, and I like the idea of silver actually because I personally give silver coins to my niece and nephews as presents.
Very smart, very
so
smart.
I actually have, it's something you can keep. It's pretty, they have a little space for it, and niece has a little space for it, and they're inexpensive now compared to where they can go. I
It's
think gold and silver increase as the value
72%
of money
below all-time
decreases.
high. I mean, it's the cheapest so-called asset on the markets today. I mean, better than gold in my opinion. Silver is more volatile than gold, but I like.
But it's
I
also
like the price.
It's also so interesting that people are so afraid to buy silver or gold because they're still valuing cash as something of value. Whereby if they put it into silver or gold, chances are down the road it's going to be worth a lot more than your dollar bill or your yen or your peso or your yuan.
Well, you see, I think cash is a holding pattern. So if you have cash set aside, understand that cash in and of itself isn't making you money. What cash is doing in the interim between being used for a better purpose is it's allowing you to assess where you can invest it in order to get an appropriate return. So having cash is okay. Relying on cash and saving cash without the idea, and this is what people listening should be always thinking, without the idea of where to put it, where's the next place I can put it, or what we call in finance, diversify it, put it in multiple places. So if one's not working for you or it's not increasing your wealth fast enough, you have a bunch of places you can draw from, whether that's hard assets. And yes, silver is much easier, much more affordable for regular people than gold. I personally have more silver than gold. It's not like all of my portfolio, but both of those two things are a portion. Silver is much higher. It's just less expensive. It's more volatile, as you said, Robert, but it also has potentially greater upside.
Right.
Any sort of a real estate investment where you're not throwing out money that you cannot afford in order to retain that piece of real estate, where you are the experts on this, but a real estate piece of property, whether it's your own home or your second home or whatever, should always yield you more if you sell it or if you rent it than what you're paying for it. Right.
Hey, we're running out of time, but the most important thing is they got to buy your book with that cash. Everybody, man, I'm not kidding. People should buy Collusion.
That is an investment in your education, and that is key.
Right. Invest in your education. Otherwise, Wall Street will educate you, and they're going to tell you one thing. Diversify and give your money to us and put it with stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and ETFs. And that's why they're going to lose, because as you know and I know, the stock market is an all-time high, and so is the bond market. We have never been in this position before with interest rates going below zero. So if you just keep holding stocks and you keep holding bonds, the tide is about to turn. And if the credit markets blow up, which I think they will, that means the bond market blows up. When the bond market blows up, you look at companies like General Electric. They used to be AAA, now they're BBB.
Right.
Pre-junk.
Right.
Why would you invest in companies that are pre-junk? Their credit is so shot right now. So that's why your book Collusion is a very important book for all readers, because you were at the heart of the whole thing, which is our central banking system. So Nomi, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Nomi. This is fantastic. And what Robert and I do is, we've done this all the time, is we get a little education. We go study about one investment. And then the most important part is, once you get a little bit of education, put a little money down. That's why silver, $17 something today. Put a little money down, and then your interest is going to go up incredibly, because you've parted with a little bit of cash.
Your mental interest, not your financial interest.
Exactly. So get the education, then put a little money down and get in the game.
So Nomi, thanks for being such a fantastic banker.
Thank you, Nomi.
You did work for Goldman Sachs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're the best. Thanks, Nomi. We'll be talking.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye. Welcome back, Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show. Good news and bad news about money. You can listen to the Rich Dad Radio program anytime, anywhere on iTunes, Android, and YouTube, my new favorite channel. And then you can please leave your review with us wherever you listen. And then all of our programs are archived at richdadradio.com. We archive them because we're an education company. If you listen to this program a second time, what you'll grasp will be quantum, and you could discuss it with friends, family, and business associates, and you'll find out you're working and living with idiots. Anyway,
if you have a question, you want to ask a question, use hashtag AskRichDad on social media.
Yeah, then we can analyze what people really want to know.
Yes.
That we talk about here. So I want to thank Nomi Prins. Her book is Collusion. Like I said, I spent 10 cold days in Alaska reading that book. I couldn't put it down because she writes it so clearly. She's obviously a very smart person, highly educated but experienced, and she made it simple, especially for those living in, she talks about Mexico, what's going on there, Japan, China, Europe, and it's a very comprehensive book. So, Rich Dad is heard and seen all over the world. And her book, Collusion, is important because the biggest problem are central banks. Remember, central banks are the same as central planning. It's communism. That's the big difference here. I'm not a communist. I'm not against communism. But central banks is one or two people telling the world what to do, especially with your money. And she worked for Goldman. And Goldman Sachs runs most of the institutions around the world.
And her mission really right now is to educate people about what's going on with the central banks, what's going on with the economy. And her website is Nomi Prins, NOMIPRINS.com, nomiprins.com. So you can go there for more information.
So one of the things which we'll talk about, what can you do if they're printing money? Well, is she said it earlier, make good use of it. And with interest rates dropping, they're now going, in Sweden and Japan, they're now sub-zero. I don't know how they can do that, but it's killing a lot of institutions. But what it does is really destroys the millennial generation because they can't get credit because they don't have enough track record. They don't make enough money. So they borrow money on credit cards at high interest rates. So that's how it's screwing everybody, especially the young people. It's really disgusting. But one of the things, like when Kim and I were just in Hungary, his name was Sandor. He's a great guy. He spoke English fluently. And he said a couple of things. We're going communist right now. You look at AOC and what's her name, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie. They're all communists. They're basically, I'm not against communists. I just don't want to be one.
Well,
you know what I mean? But anyway,
we're about people taking care of themselves financially, not depending on the government to give me a print more money and just give me money, give me money, give me money.
And people get upset, as the Republicans. I tell you what, if Trump was a Democrat, I still vote for him, given the field of people running against him. There's nobody running against Trump I would personally vote for. And I'm not Republican or Democrat because, as Nomi says, it doesn't make any difference because the central banks run the show anyway. And my concern is, Donald and I have written 2 books together. Kim and I consider him a friend, and he might be the skipper of the Titanic, if you know what I mean, is that Ronald Reagan got the credit for the big boom in the economy, and whoever's last is going to get blamed for the sinking of the economy.
And we have never even touched on the fact that, all these cities that are going bankrupt in all throughout the U.S. and throughout the world, and their solution always is to just tax the middle class. So that's another ding that's coming, that they're just going to keep taking more of your money.
So all you communists out there, what this guy Sandor said to us, which was really important, he said he was fortunate because he could travel outside the country, given it was communist, when Hungary was communist. But he says he always come home, he was depressed. It was so depressing. So he says, today I love coming home. Capitalism is flourishing. We all have opportunities to make money. They have no pensions, but other than that, they're doing a lot of things. So other than buying some silver right now, because if silver goes up, don't buy it. But right now it's cheap. But what Sandor did, because they had no loans, he just worked hard, and he took 2 houses and he married them together, right, Kim?
Yeah, he took his house and then he took another house. He put them together.
It's kind of a hatchet job, but it looks pretty good.
It looks kind of self-done. But now what he's done is he's taken his little 2-bedroom house and turned it into like a 5-bedroom house, and he rents out. He put a kitchen and a bathroom in each of the bedrooms, and now he rents them out. He's got 3 tenants. He tells us all the stories about his tenants, but he's basically financially pretty set because he had the initiative to do this.
And so he's about my age, and he's got all of these tenants, and then his mother moved in with him.
Yeah, that was a problem. So
now he has to give up his bedroom for his mother.
And he lost that tenant, so it's put a ding in his revenue.
But he's such a cute old guy, he's not a grumpy old man. He's a cute old guy. He just sits there, and he rents out these little closets with a bedroom, with a toilet and a hot plate in it. And they're happy as Larry. They're paying him rent, so he's a landlord, right?
Yep, and that's his financial plan.
And it's a retirement plan.
Yep.
And so his wife left and went to live in Indianapolis and said, you can stay here with your mother.
That's another story.
That's another story. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, stop trusting the banks and the governments. Use your little head, use your noodle, as they say, and you can always do something to protect yourself from the insanity running the world, which is the central banks, which Nomi Prins writes about in her book, Collusion. So thank you for listening to the Rich Dad Radio Show.